The hum of the city was distant now, a background rhythm to a moment that felt untouched by time. Barron Trump sat across from the woman who had once been his guide, his mentor, his teacher. The cafe, once just another stop in his day, had become a portal to a past he had nearly forgotten. Mrs. Calloway studied him, taking in the young man before her. The last time she had seen him, he had been a boy filled with curiosity, asking questions that were too big for his age. Now, he was a man who carried the weight of expectation, of scrutiny, of a world that had decided who he was before he had the chance to define it himself. She smiled gently. "It's been a long time, Barron." He nodded, exhaling slowly. "It has." The words felt heavier than they should have, not because of time, but because of everything in between. The years had shaped them both. He had grown into someone constantly watched, analyzed, and debated. She had lived long enough to see the world shift in ways she never expected. Yet, in this moment, none of that mattered. "You used to sit in the front row," she mused. "Always, so eager to know why things worked the way they did." Barron chuckled softly. "I remember. I used to drive you crazy with my questions." She laughed, shaking her head. "Not crazy, inspired. You always wanted to know more than what was in the books. You wanted to understand." He leaned back slightly, staring at his reflection in the cafe window. "I wonder if that kid would even recognize me now." Mrs. Calloway's smile faded just a little. "Do you recognize him?" The question lingered between them, hanging in the air like something fragile, something waiting to be answered. Barron didn't speak right away. He wanted to, but the words felt stuck. He had spent so long being defined by others that he wasn't sure if he even remembered who he was. Mrs. Calloway reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. "You're still in there, Barron. You just have to remember where to look." And for the first time in years, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was right. The air between them settled into something unspoken, something weighty yet familiar. Barron ran his fingers along the rim of his coffee cup, his mind stirring with memories long buried beneath years of expectations and headlines. Mrs. Calloway's voice was soft but firm. "You were always different from the other kids, Barron. Not because of your name, but because of how you saw the world. You didn't just ask questions, you challenged answers." He smirked slightly, shaking his head. "And you were the only teacher who didn't get annoyed by that." She chuckled. "Oh, I wouldn't say that, but I knew it meant something. I knew you were meant for something more." His expression shifted, the smirk fading into something deeper. "I used to believe that too." Mrs. Calloway tilted her head. "And now?" Barron exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his cup. "Now, I don't know. It's hard to believe in yourself when the whole world tells you who you're supposed to be before you even figure it out yourself." Mrs. Calloway studied him for a long moment, then leaned forward. "Barron, do you know what I remember most about you?" He looked up, curiosity flickering in his eyes. She smiled. "You never let other people's opinions shape you. You wanted to learn, not just be taught. You never accepted something just because someone in authority said it was true. You tested ideas, challenged perspectives. That's a rare thing in this world." Barron swallowed, her words striking something raw in him. "It doesn't feel like that anymore. Now it feels like no matter what I say, people have already decided whether they hate me or admire me. Either way, they don't really see me." Mrs. Calloway's eyes softened. "Then show them. Not with words, not with a name. With action." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She tapped the table gently. "I mean, if you don't like the way the world sees you, change what they see. Be the person you know you are, not the one they assume you to be." Barron leaned back, exhaling sharply. "And if that's not enough?" Mrs. Calloway smiled knowingly. "Then that's their problem, not yours." For the first time in years, Barron felt something shift inside him. a reminder of something long forgotten, a voice inside him whispering that maybe, just maybe, he had never been lost. He had just stopped looking. Barron stared at the table, tracing the rim of his coffee cup with his finger. The question echoed in his mind, lingering longer than he expected. Did he still want to matter? Or had he resigned, himself to being nothing more than a name in the background of a story he never asked to be a part of? Mrs. Calloway didn't press him for an answer. She simply waited, patient as ever, the way she used to when he struggled to put his thoughts into words in her classroom years ago. Finally, he sighed. "I don't know." She tilted her head slightly. "Why not?" His eyes flickered up to meet hers. "Because what does it even mean to matter anymore? When I was a kid, it felt simple. I wanted to build things, create something that helped people. But now it feels like everything is just noise. People fight over things that don't even matter. They turn people into symbols, villains, heroes, whatever fits their story. And I don't want to be a story, Mrs. Calloway. I just want to be me." She smiled gently. "And who is that?" Barron exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know anymore." Her expression softened, but there was no pity in her eyes, only understanding. "Then maybe it's time you remember." He let out a small, dry chuckle. "How am I supposed to do that?" She reached into her bag, pulling out something, folded and worn, its edges frayed with age. She placed it on the table, sliding it toward him. "Start here." He hesitated before picking it up, unfolding the paper carefully. As his eyes scanned the words, something inside him tightened. It was his own handwriting, messy, uneven, written in the eager scrawl of a child who hadn't yet learned to second-guess himself. "One day I will build something that helps people, and when I do, I won't care if they know my name. I'll just care that I did something good." Barron swallowed hard. The memory hit him like a wave, pulling him back to a time when he still believed in the impossible, when the world hadn't yet convinced him to doubt himself. Mrs. Calloway watched him, her voice gentle. "You wrote that in my class when you were 10. Do you still believe it?" He didn't answer right away, but for the first time in a long time, he wanted to. Barron's grip tightened on the paper as he read the words again. They were simple, almost naive. A child's dream scribbled down in a moment of pure belief. But now, years later, those words felt heavier. Not because they were untrue, but because somewhere along the way, he had stopped believing them. Mrs. Calloway studied him carefully, waiting for him to process what she already knew. The boy who had written that note was still inside him, buried under the weight of expectations, opinions, and a world that had tried to shape him into something else. He exhaled slowly, setting the paper down. "I don't know if I can be that kid again." She smiled knowingly. "You don't have to be. You just have to remember why he existed in the first place." Barron leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "It's different now. Back then, I didn't have to think about what people would say. I didn't have to worry about every move I made being analyzed, judged, turned into something it wasn't." Mrs. Calloway nodded. "And yet that never stopped you from dreaming before." He let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I guess I just got tired." Her voice softened. "Tired of what?" He looked out the window, watching people move along the sidewalk, lost in their own worlds. "Tired of being someone people don't actually see. They see the last name, they see the headlines, but they don't see me." Mrs. Calloway nodded, again, this time more slowly. "Then show them." Barron blinked, turning back to her. "What?" She smiled, folding her hands over her cup. "You've spent so much time trying to escape people's expectations that you've forgotten. You don't have to live by them. If they've already decided who you are, then let them. But you get to decide what's true." Her words settled deep in his chest. She continued. "You said you wanted to build something that helps people. So build it. Not for them. Not to prove anything. But because it's what you were meant to do." He looked down at the paper once more, reading his younger self's words again. Maybe he hadn't lost that boy after all. Maybe he had just been waiting to wake up. Barron let the words settle deep within him, stirring something that had been dormant for too long. The cafe, the world outside, the weight of expectation, all of it faded for a moment as he stared at the note. It wasn't just a memory, it was a promise. One he had made to himself before the world complicated everything. Mrs. Calloway didn't rush him, she simply waited, her eyes filled with quiet certainty. She had always known how to guide him, not by giving answers, but by reminding him that he already had them. Slowly, he exhaled. What if it's too late? Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Too late for what? He hesitated. To matter. To be more than what people think I am. She shook her head. Barron, you've already mattered long before anyone had an opinion about you. That's not something they can take away. The only thing that's ever been in question is whether you still believe it. His fingers traced the edge of the note, the words echoing in his mind. He thought of all the times he had silenced his own voice to avoid becoming another headline. All the times he had let people define him because fighting back felt like a battle he couldn't win. Maybe he had been fighting the wrong battle all along. Maybe it was never about proving them wrong. Maybe it was about proving himself right. He looked up at Mrs. Calloway, something new flickering behind his eyes. I want to remember. Her expression softened. Then start now. The cafe was still the same. The people outside still moved through their day. But something inside Barron had shifted, a quiet but certain resolve settling in his chest. He folded the note carefully, tucking it into his pocket like a compass pointing him home. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward it.